Many of us don't express our interests as individual citizens, but instead have those interests expressed by groups that we belong to. Those groups express our interests are expressed by those groups, hence the name interest groups. I'm sure you've heard of interest groups before. You probably think of something a little bit more malevolent, but any group that's expressing the interests of people is an interest group, and it's an important component of interest articulation. So, interest articulation can occur through the action of social and political groups that represent groups of people. And there are different types of groups, and we'll look at those types here. There are anomic groups, which are spontaneous. They form suddenly in response to some event. There's no structure or planning, it's just a reaction. For example, the depiction of Muhammad in a Danish cartoon led to widespread spontaneous protests in several Muslim countries and even in European countries outside of Danish embassies. This was an anomic group. This was a spontaneous group articulating interests, more than just a citizen. The Rodney King verdict back in the 1990s led to protests and rioting in LA. Again, a spontaneous group, an anomic group, articulating the interests of more than one person. There are also non-associational groups, groups that have common interests, maybe people of the same occupation or people who live in the same region. These are rarely well organized, and activity by non-associational groups is episodic. For example, the 2005 Paris immigration riot. French youths of North African origin who were living in the suburbs and exurbs of Paris rioted, and a state of emergency was declared. They share a common problem. They share interests, and they operated as a collective, but they were non-associational. They weren't walking around beforehand with membership cards or have any kind of formal association, but rather they had common interests. They were immigrant communities living in the same regions, feeling disadvantaged by French laws, and that brought them together to mobilize and articulate their interests. It's hard to organize non-associational groups. Individuals want to gain the reward that comes from common action, but usually don't want to bear the costs. So think of your fellow Saddleback students as a non-associational group. It would be very hard to organize this non-associational group. Say they said, let's all protest outside of the dean's office on this certain date. You would probably think to yourself, my being at that protest isn't going to make that big of a difference, and I'm not really bound to this group in any tight way. Instead, I can go to the beach that day, and if something good comes of that protest, I'll still benefit because I'm a Saddleback student. So this is the kind of collective action problem that non-associational groups run into, and why they remain non-associational. Institutional groups, you see we're getting more and more formal here, are formal organizations that have other political or social functions, but then also articulate interests. So think of political parties or corporations or bureaucracies or churches. They do other things, they serve other political functions, but they also articulate interests. The USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, it advocates for agricultural interests. In addition to doing many other things, one of the things it does is it articulates the interests of American agriculture, of the industry. The military-industrial complex, that conglomeration of defense contractors and researchers and the government agencies that regulate them or work with them, the military, they all have shared interests, and they will articulate those interests to the leaders. They will say to Congress people or say to the presidents or to other elected officials who make policy. These are the interests of the country. Really, they're the interests of a group, of that institutional group. But those parts of the government, the military, the committees overseeing the defense industry and overseeing the military. They will articulate interests as a group. And finally, you have associational groups. And these are groups that are formed explicitly to represent the interests of a particular group. Articulating interests is what they are about. Trade unions, chambers of commerce, ethnic associations. The Humane Society of the United States is an interest group that articulates the interests of people who care about animals. The Anti-Defamation League is an interest group that articulates the interests of its members against slander, especially towards Israel or Judaism. The picture there is, and if extra points if you recognize this fellow, that's Frank Sobotka from the second season of the late great television show The Wire, who represented the union on the Baltimore docks, the stevedores. So associational groups are interest groups in the way that you're probably used to thinking of them. Chambers of commerce that represent business interests in a community. Groups that have members and speak on behalf of those members. Okay, so interest groups come in many shapes and sizes, from the kind of sporadic, spontaneous, unorganized type to the more formalized associational groups. And the purpose, however, the function is the same, and that is to articulate the interests of multiple people.